Welcome back to the Prepare Like a Pro live chat show. My name's Jack McLean. I'm your host, and today my guest is Tim McGrath. He's a sports and exercise physiotherapist with over 15 years of experience working in professional sport and 20 years experience working in clinical practice. Tim has completed his PhD from the Research Institute of Sport and Exercise at the University of Canberra on the topic of ACL rehabilitation and to return to sport from a knee injury in 2016. He is a clinical research director of a US, UK, and Australian-based company, Pitch Ready, which focuses on blending clinical insights with data science, squad-based injury prevention strategies, and return to sport testing following lower limb injury. He regularly conducts clinical consultancy to professional sporting teams and second opinions to complex cases following lower limb injury. Since 2004, Tim has worked in the clinical appointments with professional sporting teams such as the George Illawarra Dragons, Port Adelaide Football Club, Australian Men's Rugby Sevens team, Brumbies Super Rugby team, Sale Sharks Rugby Football, and Canberra Raiders. Before we start this episode, for those new to our podcast, our mission here at Prepare Like a Pro is to empower aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. If you like the show, please show support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Welcome, Tim. Thanks for jumping on, mate.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
We'll get right into the start of your career. At what age did you discover you had a passion for sports physiotherapy and specifically working with athletes?
I reckon for me, probably the common story I reckon with a lot of physios would say their first experience was, getting injured yourself playing football and then, going and seeing someone and then, being thinking that might be a pretty cool sort of a job to do. So that was probably the starting point for me, I reckon.
Yeah. And was it a particular physio that you recall that once you had an injury and they helped you return to play that you can recall, or was it just the general?
It was a guy named Ed Hollis that I saw who's he must be sort of 20 years older than me, who ended up being my first boss when I actually did start physio. So once I'd got out of uni. So he was probably one of my biggest mentors, really. So he likes to say that when he first met me, I was wet behind the ears, and everything that I might have done well, he takes full credit for it. So it's probably a fair claim.
Yeah. And what part of the industry did you particularly grow to, or what that attracted you to the role?
I didn't even know before I started uni. I didn't even know physios worked in hospitals, like in different sort of wards and all that. So as far as I knew, physio was all about sport. So that for me was the attraction from the get go.
Yep. Okay. And once you did your bachelor's of sports science and you're getting exposed to different sides of physiotherapy, and obviously your passion was working with athletes, was that something that you grew to straight away, or did you like some of the other sides?
I thought when I finished my undergrad, right, that's it. I'm never studying kind of ever again. I thought that was it. And I reckon probably sort of 2 years into it, I started getting a bit itchy and then kind of went and did a master's sports physio, which at the time was, if you wanted to work in any of these kind of environments, it basically became a mandatory requirement anyway. But you sort of, every time I've done any study, it's not because it's been kind of forced on me. It's been sort of driven by some kind of burning desire to learn something new, do something different, push some kind of boundary. So I did a master's. I think I finished physio in 2002. So I finished physio in 2002, and then started a master's. I actually had a false start. Went up to UQ to do a master's up there, sort of 2 years out. I'd only been up there for about 3 months, and then the Raiders rang up and said, did I want to kind of come home and start working in there? So ended up having to put it off for a couple of years, and then didn't finish that till I was at the Brumbies around sort of 2007. And then I thought, right, that's it. I'm never studying ever again. And then started getting itchy sort of about 4 years later, and fell into a PhD after that. So it's kind of just been one thing after the every time I thought I was done with something, I just end up falling into something else.
Yeah. And is that the thirst for learning? Is that just in terms of continual professional growth, or is the purpose bigger than that? Like you mentioned, trying to make an impact on the industry. Was it?
None of it was ever about having a piece of paper, for sure. Even like the PhD, I kind of fell into that, where it had a couple of surgeons sort of asking for formalized rehab protocols, sort of relating to ACL. And I didn't feel comfortable handing it to them unless I had some kind of validated sort of study behind it. So started doing some things where I went, okay, validation sort of requires, objective, data, which means you've got to have equipment to be able to do that. The only place that had that equipment was the university, and the only way the university was going to give you that equipment was if it was part of a formal sort of a research degree. So it kind of went from this small thing into like a massive sort of a project quite quickly. And then everything since then has always been about trying to make your actual job better. Like, nothing about the PhD. It was all clinically applied, as in the outputs of it were all about trying to make my job a little bit easier rather than, trying to force it in. So I've known, friends of mine that still work in professional sport have, asked me about things like PhDs, and for quite a few of them, it sort of feels like it's something that they're logically just supposed to do rather than having some kind of burning, nagging thing that's annoying them that they just want to try and sort of get on top of. And I reckon that's the wrong reason to do a PhD. It sort of has to be born out of having a desire to learn something or remove a barrier, because it's a long process, and if you don't have that sort of intrinsic motivation, then I reckon it becomes a pretty hard sort of slog on the back end of it.
Yeah, so it's a lot different to, I guess, how we approach the masters, where, like you mentioned, if you want to work in the industry, it's potentially a box you probably need to tick at some stage. The PhD probably needs to be a little bit more intrinsic in your motivation and a real purpose driven on your topic. Is that how you would look at it?
And yeah, definitely. Like the PhD, like it probably went in that order in terms of the enjoyment. Like my physio degree, there were lots of aspects of it that I really didn't like. The masters was sort of better, but there were lots of things where the PhD in itself was probably the most enjoyable, because you really got to choose everything that you wanted to do there. So if you thought it sucked, then it was really you're the only person to blame, because you really decide what the format of it is and the areas that you're going to sort of chase. And I really thought with a PhD, I thought, okay, by the end of it, I'm going to know everything. And really all it does is teach you to be quite critical of things. And all you can really do now is just see holes in kind of everything we do. So it sort of opens your eyes in a big way, I reckon.
And you mentioned orthopedic surgeons were reaching out for a framework. Was that for them to be able to give to athletes? Was that for physiotherapists?
It was really about trying to create some structure between, like, on the back end with rehab. Obviously surgeons have their area, and then rightly or wrongly, they probably get blamed for aspects of what happens sort of after the operation. So I think for a few of them, it was about trying to set some robust processes for physios that they work with, in general. That was about sort of trying to create some frameworks for them to kind of operate on, so that then they, had an ability to have some control over that, rather than just sort of athlete going off into space and then, having no idea what, happened after that.
Yeah, it makes sense, because if they're judging the success of their intervention and they didn't have any control of post surgery, then it makes it a bit difficult to measure.
It must be a tough existence for them sometimes, I reckon, because a lot of their work happens obviously right at the beginning, and then then after the fact is whether it went well or not, and so there's probably a massive sort of waiting game for them. So definitely, and since then, since we've I've had a lot more involvement in terms of that kind of post injury benchmarking, that they enjoy it as much as the actual clinicians who are sort of working on the front lines, because for them, athletes sort of go off into never land, and they may or may not have them, or they come into the clinic and they see them, and there's only limited information they can get once they sort of see them. So for them, it's the ability to have some surveillance as to what's happening in that rehab space as well.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense in terms of pitch ready, and I'm sure go into more detail about pitch ready in a second. But it almost sounds like this was the planting of the seed with the work that you were doing with orthopedic surgeons and athletes at this time, and then liaising with other people in the industry. It must have been a nice compliment for surgeons to be reaching out to yourself for that framework. In terms of going into the PhD, how long did it take you to complete your PhD while working in sport?
I started at a lot of the groundwork. I was still working in Super Rugby at the time. And so I think I started it formally in 2012, and then I submitted it in 2016 when I was working at Port Adelaide. So it's probably the best part of 4 years to get it all done.
Good effort. Yeah.
It was good. My family was sort of toing and froing between Canberra and Adelaide, so it probably meant that I had a bit more bachelor time than I'd normally get. That meant that I could get it done in a reasonably quick period of time.
Yeah, and in terms of ACL, obviously it's unfortunately a long injury to rehab. Was there like massive changes that you found by going through and really looking at a specific injury over 4 years that thoroughly?
It's grown so much. Like even the way that I do things now, compared to probably 3 or 4 years ago, it's growing massively. Like back in 2012, for example, measurement of capacity was a new thing. Like everything was very much time based. When you're X months, you do Y, and probably just exposure to rehab and having no adverse events probably dictated where you were in the rehab. What we sort of learned is that the human body is an incredibly sort of clever piece of technology, and it can bypass things and make up for inefficiencies. But the closer you get to the pointy end, a lot of those strategies can run out. So it was really sort of dipping down different areas and then trying to work out, that cocktail that probably gives an athlete a best chance of success on the back end of it.
Yep. And going back to influences, you mentioned Ed Hollis. Were there some other mentors, if you like, or strong influences over your career to help you to this point?
Definitely, like early days, I was really lucky to work with some really good sports physicians as well. Like Canberra, probably just via the AEST was a bit of a fluke, really, where there were some really good sports physicians, guys by the name of David Hughes, who is the Chief Medical Officer at the AEST, Warren McDonald, who's now sort of the Chief Medical Officer at Rugby Australia. And there's been a whole sort of, they were probably provided a training program that's a lot of the well-known surgeons, sports physicians around Australia basically passed through there. So it was this really good place where just via sort of osmosis, you could pick their brain, you could, and they taught you to be really quite, all about diagnosis and having a really good plan from the outset, because if you know where you're going, then the rest of it can sort of fall into place. Is where if you get the diagnosis wrong, then really everything subsequent to that can fall away really, really quite quickly. So those guys are guns at being really clear about a diagnosis and a plan. Ed taught me to like in terms of communication and having real clarity with the athlete. It's not just about what you do and the technical knowledge; it's the way you communicate it, and you're playing a mental game as much as anything else. So a lot of the time, so was that probably the combination of those guys, really, I think, and then the rest of it was you pick and choose sort of along the way. A lot of the S&C guys that I work with were really good, and you sort of glean little bits from there. So I'd say like early days, those guys probably were really big influences on me, and then subsequent to that, you learn along the way, because the beauty of working in professional sport is you are exposed to people who are at the top of their game, and it's hard not to sort of learn some pretty cool things off them.
Absolutely. It's a good segue for the practitioners and staff that are listening in that either want to have their first crack at elite sport. You mentioned earlier how while doing your masters, you actually were asked to come back and work at the Raiders. So it seemed that you got some good momentum early on in your career with working in elite sport. What would you put that to? Was it
a lot of it was just word of mouth, really. So it was working with people who are, working in that area, like, is probably, when you get asked, how do I crack it in sport? It was probably, for me, it was just put yourself in the environment, don't say no to anything. And it really sort of just grew from there.
Mm-hmm. And you've worked in different codes as well. Like, is that through building a strong network base of people working in different sports? Was that deliberate early on, or that's just sort of naturally progressed?
I think it was a bit of both, to be honest. Like, I really wanted to do sort of different things. So, the Raiders just sort of happened. Same thing. I went over to the UK. I was going to work over at Sale Sharks, and I wasn't there. I was supposed to be there for 2 years, and not long after getting there, the Brumbies rang up and said, "Oh, same thing. Do you want to come home?" So it feels like every time I leave Canberra, I just get sucked back like into the vortex. But again, that was a sort of an organic thing. Then everything after that was sort of just about chasing opportunity or new things sort of as it went. The AFL was the same thing. It was and it's in hindsight, it probably wasn't the reason that I did it, but in hindsight, it's been really good because you can see the commonalities between sort of different sports, and each of them has their own sort of subtle cultural thing that they, from the S&C world and from the rehab space, they all have their sort of their ways of doing things. And in certain situations, I reckon, evolution is that's a good thing. But then certain injuries, the way other codes tended to look after it, like the rugby codes, for example, have a really strong emphasis on strength, for example. So if you get a lot of tendon-based injuries or some of these kind of overuse ones, the way they do things, I think is really good. So not just having just in the AFL world, obviously is very much about running-based models and trying to get everyone, get their meterage up as quickly as possible. So it was sort of the cross-pollination of the two for me was really good.
And looking into your work now, like you mentioned, a more strength-based sort of rugby model compared to the running-based, would that be, like, obviously a lot of different factors that you take into account in which one that you're going to go with, but tending to such a more soft tissue to type of athlete, their physical sort of, like when you do your batteries of tests and their sort of deficits, talk us through your thought process and when you'll pull from different experiences.
I think it's more like, especially what I do now, is it just gives you an awareness of probably the scope of, the checklist of things that probably help give, an athlete a better chance of success, particularly when they're sort of coming back from an injury. So very much the pitch ready stuff that I have now is really about, there is that checklist, and you're trying to have something to hang your hat on as to where the athlete sits in that space, as a way of being able to explain, priority areas to go at, or what they might do with certain thing. For example, we talk about ankle stiffness, where, or positions of foot contact, to try and, which can create stress or not. And on the back end of it, you're trying to work out, is it a capacity thing? Does the athlete just need more oomph in the leg versus, is it a skill preference? Is it, it's just something that they've always done and will do. And it's really about being targeted, not making assumptions. So just doing calf strength in someone who has that's their skill preference, you're really not going to make any relevant changes at all. And then being realistic about that as well, because skill changes, can be quite a period of time to change. And if you're leaving yourself, the whole concept of return to sport, I really don't like, because especially on the back end of it, where when you start talking about some of these skill preferences, which especially with ACL, it's a motor control issue often as much as anything else. And if you're leaving in that rehab space where the body's become very good at sort of problem solving around it and protecting itself, if those things are allowed to stay in there till the back end of it, then trying to do something about that on the back end is really, really tough when they're told the coach they're going to be 3 weeks away or something like that. So it's like watching a bus crash sometimes. So from my point of view, it's a lot of intervene, be definitive and do it nice and early, particularly with the skill component. So that way you've got as much time to do it.
Yeah, and now, looking at your website, there's obviously a lot of kinematics involved in your testing. Is that where you'll, in terms of the skill aspect of moving and running, you'll give that they go through obviously their objective markers, but also how are they moving with change of direction and at high speed, and then you might give them some drills and some things that they need to do from a motor learning point of view, as well as their rehab or as part of their rehab.
That's right. I sort of use like two analogies with this. You've got the racing car team, so you've got the car and you've got the driver, and the car is measures the capacity, so ability for the leg to absorb and produce force. And you've got the racing car driver, which is the ability to, under pressure, for the body to execute things in a way that is, safe rather than likely to sort of cause problems. So really it's about, the kinematic stuff and the biomechanics. I'm not a classic sort of coming from a biomechanics stream. It was really just born out of wanting to remove biases, because we think we see things, especially when you start talking about skill acquisition, but you'd be surprised how your biases can sort of play out and can mislead you a little bit. So it's really about trying to have a robust process around that. And the technology evolves sort of all the time. And really for me, it's I'll pick and choose based on things that are out there. So it's not about pushing a particular piece of equipment or technology. It's really the ones that just remove barriers on the back end of it, just to help practical implications of when you're looking after an athlete.
And for the coaches listening in that deal with rehab, what would be an example of a test, a common result that you see in terms of the mechanics, and then a prescription that you'd give them in terms of motor learning and improving their skill?
It can be a bit of a dark art in terms of the skill side of things, but it's really about especially when you start talking about ACLs, it's roughly about 40 milliseconds from ground contact. So it's like that. So really we hone in on under pressure, someone changing direction at high speed, and really just that instant of foot contact, snapshots of where the body is in space.
Mm-hmm.
So a common hangover that probably stays there is when someone goes in to change a direction, if they're going to step off their right leg, they'll typically try and do something to use the good leg as much as humanly possible. So often that looks like something like a crossover cut where they decel quite heavily on the inside leg and then kind of push through, and which is fine in that example where their body made a decision and it's going to go off to that way. The problems can happen where they have to change their mind and they have to sort of shift their momentum to go onto the outside, which then makes them sort of reach out really wide to generate that horizontal force, stiff straight leg, and everything then just becomes like a powder keg where knee is really stiff and straight. If they plonk on their heel, so nothing is absorbed at the ankle, then it doesn't take many layers of sort of chaos really to kind of bring it undone. So when we do all the benchmarking, it's not about trying to absolutely replicate a football scenario. It's trying to have it sterile enough that you can compare apples to apples, but then also push elements that are pretty close to the back end of it, which is high speed, unanticipated change of direction, just so you can make sense of it. But also there has to be some a reasonably small stepping off point to where their sport kind of sits.
Yeah, perfect, mate. Well said, and that's a great segue for introducing Pitch Ready. No doubt the listeners probably are already aware, but for those that aren't, we've mentioned in terms of the creation from it came on from your PhD and working closely with surgeons and physios and providing a framework. But talk us through the thinking behind creating it and currently your role within the company.
So it was really, like I was saying, PhD was okay. Tried lots of things, and it was really just trial and error at the end of the day. And then it evolved. Like I said, early days it was very much about capacity, and we thought the capacity was going to solve all our problems in terms of people who are risky for re-injury. But then realised that really that wasn't addressing quite a large component of that rehab space. If all it was to make someone big and powerful, we just turn them into someone that could deadlift 300 or something like that, and then no one would ever get hurt again. So there's an element of sport, obviously, that revolves around skill, and really it was just about trying to be objective about trying to quantify that.
Challenging task.
Yes, and like I said, it continues to evolve all the time. So the way that we sort of do things now versus 3 years ago is expanding sort of all the time. So it's good because it's motivating, because you never sort of feel like you're there and it's all sorted, and nothing else is needed. So my role now really is that bridging between, I'm a clinician first, and then a sort of a scientist or a nerd sort of second. So it's really just about trying to, like, I went and did a computer science degree after the PhD because I really needed to be able, these things pump out massive volumes of data, and I was in meetings with some pretty smart sort of computer scientists, but the language that they talk versus what we as clinicians talk, what do our eyes want to see, and what, versus bringing it down to a black and white line of code that then, can define what you're sort of trying to look at. There's a bit of an art to that. So really for me now, it's being the bridging between the technology, understanding the data, and then really trying to put it into clinical practice, because capturing data is brilliant, and lots of people sort of do it, but at the end it has to be brought down to a fairly simple, meaningful sort of output. Otherwise there's really no point. And I reckon that's the trap for young players, is they capture all sorts of things, really don't have a massive understanding as to what the output of it is going to be, and the implementation of it then therefore is really often not that great. As where you see people who've been around for a long time, they have a really clear idea of what they want, they don't want to waste their time, and everything that they tend to capture really has a meaningful sort of output for them. Otherwise they don't want to waste their time.
Yeah. And you mentioned doing some further research in data science. For those that have spent a fair bit of time with experience in coaching and experience with their coaching eye, and you mentioned how even the best coaches, potentially there's going to be obviously bits that are missed with bias. With the data science side of things, how much time and energy does it take to build up your ability to be able to look at a report and quickly analyze and put it into practice?
I don't like the comparison, but it's the only one that makes sense to me. It's a little bit like, once you pull it all together, it's a little bit like an MRI, where you're, there's the art that comes sort of on the back end of it. So everything that we built up a normative database, over sort of many years, and then really the standard deviation, or the variability in the data from a capacity point of view is massive compared into if they're a professional basketballer versus soccer player versus AFLW versus, all that sort of stuff. So the variability in that is quite tight. So you have to really know your population. Interestingly, on the skill act side of it, positions that stress the body is really much narrower. And if you think about it, the way that we test someone's knee, for example, to see if they've busted their ACL is really quite consistent across teenagers, adults, tall, short, whatever. And it's so it really sort of probably highlights that the positions that stress the body are quite quite consistent across lots of different populations. But the amount of oomph that someone has in their leg is there is quite varied. So you really have to know the strengths and weaknesses of the information you're sort of capturing.
Yeah, and for the athletes that are listening, or maybe parents of athletes that are going through rehabilitation, is it just ACL injuries that Pitch Ready helps with?
No, it's lower limbs. So, and the good thing about things like ACL, which is where it was sort of born out of the first place, was it is a long journey, and it really does delve with, the foot and ankle has implications for the knee, the hip and groin has implications for the knee. So, you'll see lots of people, for example, do an ACL and then go on to have hip and groin issues, because the mechanics of what they do from a compensatory point of view is there's a lot of commonality through there. So the way that I manage the mechanics of change of direction with someone with hip and groin is there's a lot of commonality with the knee. Post Achilles rupture, chronic calf issues, overuse syndromes, Achilles issues, tibial stress, like a lot of those sorts of things really when you start looking at a lot of this is, especially when we start talking about compensatory patterns, is for lots of years we just focused on making that bit of tissue really quite strong and robust. But when you start looking at this stuff, you realize that just it's about trying to get the load shared across multiple sort of body regions. So someone has hip and groin issues, you can get the groin unit really quite strong, but if they're changing direction really wide of their center of mass because they're doing something like that crossover cut thing that we were talking about, then that puts the groin at a really out of range position. So if you can get them sort of in tighter where they have good tissue tolerance and they can also share the load through lateral hip and all those sorts of things, then that's the path of least resistance, because you're sort of coming at it from multiple angles rather than just trying to get it really strong and hoping that that's all that's really needed.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And for those listening that are interested, we'll add in all the links in the show notes. Going back to your career, mate, what's a highlight, and there might be a couple of highlights that you're really proud of to date?
I reckon it's a hard question to answer, because there's lots of things that happen sort of along the way. Like there's things like being involved in Super Rugby. You get to travel over to South Africa. Port Adelaide, they had showdowns. Some of those sort of games where there's massive crowds. In South Africa, there'd be all these Sathas sort of baying for your blood, even as the physio getting hurled abuse at. So there's just these different environments that you don't get exposed to if you're just working in Australia, kind of thing. So that was, that's cool. What I do now, I really, really like, because it really, often you're dealing with people who are coming back from long-term injury, and sometimes they've hit barriers in their rehab, and they're sort of looking to you to try and sort of help kick things along a little bit. And I've had some ones that have had a really shocking run, and then people have done 4 knees or something, and still 3-4 years later, once they're now back playing. So
life changing.
Yeah. So you feel like it's you have an ability to potentially sort of help people in a really sort of a shit time, and that's really quite satisfying as well, because it's it's helping people, which is probably why I wanted to get into physio in the first place. Is you were trying to be the good guy rather than the bad guy. So a lot of those things along the way, are definitely some highlights for me.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. No, great work. And on not necessarily the flip side, but from a growth point of view, professionally, what have been some significant challenges that you've faced, and what have you learnt from them?
I think like the programs that I've been involved in where they actually haven't had good success probably are the ones that you learn the most from, because if you're in a team and everyone's winning, then no one really asks too many questions. And as we're the ones where things haven't really gone to plan, then people are asking questions. Most time they do a review in a football club is because the results haven't been what they wanted, and everyone's sort of scurrying around. So a lot of those things made you really think quite critically about your processes, and as you got experience, you were really trying to think of those things in advance. What can go wrong here? How can I show evidence that that's been mitigated, or we've tried to control for that, and all these different things. So really, probably the programs that really weren't going well were probably the ones that probably sharpened me up a little bit in terms of how I tend to operate. And then really these days, it's really the limitation of technology, where there's, especially when you start talking about biomechanics and motion capture and those sorts of things, there's this spectrum between things that are potentially a bit more robust and drilled down, ability to be quite accurate, and how they can be a bit slower and cumbersome to sort of get, versus things which are quick and easy, but then the accuracy of it can sort of dive off. So really you're sort of playing in that spectrum where don't overcomplicate it if you don't need to, but then also don't try and make assumptions about where someone's at in their rehab based off kind of limited information. So again, it's the lessons there have been good in the sense of, like I said, having good knowledge of the data. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? And having a self-awareness of that.
Yeah. And you mentioned early on with a couple of influences with Dave and Warren, the importance of a thorough diagnosis in working in elite sport. Sometimes time can be challenging. What about with some of the lower limb injuries that are more significant and athletes facing a long period of time? What would be a consistent time frame that you would need to go through your battery of tests to be able to have all the information that you need to feel confident?
So it depends on the stage. Yeah, particularly with what I do now, with pitch ready stuff, it probably depends on the stage of it. So and really the numbers involved. So we do whole squads, for example, within a day, but it's really like a Formula One pit crew. So you've got a person on each sort of job. As where if you're just working one-on-one with an athlete, then really it becomes a bit more hierarchy. I'll sort of take on a lot of the flow of the prep and the actual calibration and the capture, and then the things that sort of come after that. So a typical somewhere around sort of an hour and a half really to go through it all, and then sort of go away and synthesize it all, and then normally you sit down with the staff afterwards, or if it's more community level, you'll sit down with the physio that or the rehab coach that's responsible for looking after that person, and like I said, it's really that conduit between the coalface of people who are looking after it and the technology, and then try and give them some hopefully some usable action items to kind of address.
Yep. And for when a whole squad comes in and you're consulting with sporting organisations, how does that look? What are you sort of looking at? What are some common questions or problems that you saw?
It was born very much out of the post-injury stuff, where you're talking to athletes and to the staff, and you go, this is, what you're doing here is really historically doesn't bode well in the rehab space. And I said, well, I think I used to do that beforehand. So that's where the challenges of things like symmetry have come into it, where we're assuming that the good leg is a good leg, and all of that sort of stuff is, it's arguably about making someone better than what they were. So
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this squad-based stuff is really a similar process, but it's really theme-based, where you're sort of looking at all those components, capacity, jump qualities, change of direction, body positioning with jumping, and a lot of those sorts of movements, and then really trying to give them, we talk about FIFA 11, for example, like a injury prevention sort of programs. It doesn't in any way deal with dose response. So does the athlete actually respond to it? And really doesn't, you think in sport you have heaps of time to deal with, look after someone, but when you get into it, you actually really don't. So previous injury is a really strong predictor of future injury. So really the whole process is about trying to give, people working on the coalface things that are, narrow the spectrum down. So rather than trying to go for a FIFA 11 style program where they're just trying to hit, throw as many sort of darts as possible and hope something hits, is things where they're actually in a good space, probably deprioritize that slightly, things that are important and, they're not in as close to a normal space compared to that population, really try and prioritize those. So it's really about trying to be as proactive as possible and narrowing the focus as much as possible.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's some assistance there with prescription of programming. Is that through consulting with yourself, or is that another?
Yeah, it's really like, again, especially when you start working at it can be a little bit harder when you're working recreationally, because you get a very sort of level of experience. But when you're working on the pointy end in professional sport, there's people who are pretty good operators in their own right. So those ones, it's very much, there's many roads that sort of lead to Rome, and how one operator will deal with that particular theme versus another one, I think is up for debate. So really it's theme based, and I'll happily tell people what things that have worked for me historically, but by no means is it didactic, and it has to be done that way, because there are plenty of ways of attacking the same problem for sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned the common one is the inside leg crossing over. What are some sort of common cues or drills that you would bring in to try and work on that
Like we try and I feel like I've failed in the rehab if someone is doing that really late just in a fairly unconstrained task. They are doing that where they're offloading. So really it's early days, things just lane changes, linear running. We do heaps of sort of banded perturbator drills, water bag drills, all designed to sort of try and give them a sense of load and trying to tuck their foot under. And there is some sort of coaching that goes with that, like giving athletes feedback, but the skill there is to not overwhelm them. It's a bit like people that have played golf before. If the coach, trying to work on your swing, and if they give you 50 cues, then by the end of it, you can't even hit the golf ball anymore. So it's really about you don't throw too many things at them at once. If there's 10 things there, just work on one, get good at that. So just pick the most important one to start off with, and then sort of work the way through that, which is where, like I said, the skill aspect of it is you need time to be able to do that. So rehab traditionally was very sort of hierarchical. We get them strong first, then we'd start running, then we'd start sort of agility, sport specific type progressions. As where now I tend to do it really quite horizontally, where I have it I've got each of those things going sort of concurrently, and I try and get them in as early as possible, because you just want as much time to sort of try and chase those things and not leave it till the very end.
And is it as simple for the coaches listening in when drip feeding in that horizontal approach with drills, if they're using the crossover step, the drill is potentially too advanced for them, so just scale it down to where they feel confident to be able to do it?
Yeah, and generally the place of some of those isolated or gym type drills can be useful, just because it narrows the drill right down, so that you're just trying to teach them what that is supposed to feel like, and then then start layering in over the top. So when you're doing rehab running, I reckon a lot of people might just drive past and look at it and say, how good's his job? All he's doing is just playing games with someone, like like some kind of school holiday program. But the reality is that you're trying to bridge the gap as much as possible with basically what they have to go back to. And there's this process of getting them there, so that, you're trying to make it, like I said, there's progressions and regressions, and it's all based on competency based. When they can do one thing, bring it up a notch, go up a notch, until eventually, there's chaos, and intensity going at the same time. And that's what sport is at the end of the day.
Yeah. And comparing that vertical to the horizontal approach, when you see that crossover step late in rehab, how you mentioned that can be a pretty bit of a red flag that the process hasn't gone quite where you would have liked it. Would that athlete typically test well in the capacity test, like you mentioned, like your Nord board?
They can do, yeah, they definitely can do, and that's where it doesn't happen so much now, but early days, I used to get athletes where they were, literally at the end, and the club was sort of looking for a tick box to sort of send them back, and those things could happen. And it was not good, because you just knew that doing something about that was really going to be quite tough when you're right at the pointy end. So that can be I personally, I feel like I've failed if a lot of those things are allowed to persist so far down the track. It's something you want to chase a lot earlier.
Yeah. And in your personal preference, then, would you rather see sport organisations and rehab coaches come to pitch earlier on in the rehab, and then so you've got guidance?
Yeah,
just at the end for a confidence booster.
Yeah, obviously a lot of your capacity-based things you do reasonably early. So if it's a knee reconstruction, for example, once they've gone into that sort of mid to end volume phase, is when you'd start doing a lot of that capacity-based stuff, which is really just about can the legs start to absorb and produce force. And then a lot of the skill aspect of it is probably the most useful time is when they're changing direction around sort of 70% and getting to the point where your eyes can't obviously sort of pull things to pieces, and you're really starting to think about, okay, where am I going to go for that next 6 weeks? That's probably the most useful time, I reckon. And on the back end of it, it can be good to get evidence of normality, because that historically is people who are within a normal range compared to the population you're dealing with is, historically that's one of the better insurance policies you're probably going to get. So that's reassuring to an athlete. But in terms of the implementation of it, really earlier is a lot better, because it just gives you time to sort of go chasing themes.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. We'll move into the get to know Tim section, mate, the personal side of the questions, less technical. So favorite inspirational quote or life motto? Have you got one?
Maybe you always end up where you're supposed to be.
I like it. That's
So
good.
I've seen plenty of people sort of try and fluff their way in teams and, be a bit sneaky about the way they do things, but they don't tend to last very long. So I'm a firm believer in you always end up where you're supposed to be.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good one. And what about in your work life? Do you have pet peeves? Anything that fires you up?
Especially around the workplace, I'm a real clean freak, I reckon. So I like, maybe it's the OCD playing out or something like that. So the staff that we work with, I'm always sort of busting their chops about, keeping the gym tidy and those sorts of things. So I'm forever riding them like a bike like that.
Yep.
So maybe that's my number one, I'd say.
Yep. And what about favorite way to spend your day off, mate? Do you get many?
I've got kids that are sort of varying from ages 9 to 13. So I think this afternoon I'm helping my oldest with algebra. So the spare time is attempting to try and do some things with the family. But yeah, if I can, I still enjoy going for a wave or going to the gym and doing those sorts of things. So it's no real structured sport these days. It's just sneak out and do things when you can.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for jumping on, mate, and sharing with us your experiences, and both in research as well as in the clinic, and getting your hands dirty with helping athletes. Like you mentioned, some are coming back after 4 knee recos. So it's a huge impact you're making on the industry, not only with the athletes, but also with staff and sporting organisations as well, mate. For those that want to get in contact, where's the best place to follow you or DM you? Or send emails?
So I'm not a massive social media sort of warrior, but I do have all of those. So usually I can get contact that, or the Pitchery website or the Elite Rehab website. There's admin contacts there, and usually that kind of finds its way.
Yep. Yeah, awesome. We'll add them all in the show notes, guys, for those listening in. Maybe you're driving in the podcast, so you can do that at the end if you drive. But thanks again, mate. What's on the horizon? You got plenty of moving parts, it sounds like. What's on the horizon for 2022?
Off to the States. So borders are starting to open up again. It's good. So doing some stuff over in the States with the NBA franchise. So that's
fantastic.
Cool. That's the beauty these days, is get lots of variety. So it's good stimulation.
So how does that work if you're not at your clinic or with access to your equipment? Do you use a local university for sporting organisations?
So I'm taking stuff over there. The idea is to try and sort of help them get their own sort of solution set up. And so I'll take some gear over. So I look like Queen Victoria sort of traveling over at the moment. But hopefully then in the end I'm trying to make myself as redundant as humanly possible.
Yep. Very good. Yeah. Well, thanks again, mate. Any final words or anything that we missed that you'd like to mention?
No, I think probably everyone's sick of my voice by now.
Very good. Well, thanks again, mate. And for those that are tuned in, if you tune in late, make sure to watch the start of the episode. This will live on our YouTube channel. And if you want to listen to the podcast, we'll release it next week. Our next Prepare Like a Pro live chat show will be with Brendan Eagleston, he's the rehab coach at Melbourne Football Club. So you can join us. That's this Wednesday at 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time.